Hello, everyone. My name is Marcus Merrell. I want to thank DQ for letting me give this presentation today. I'm the Vice President of Technology Strategy for Sauce Labs, which is kind of a mouthful, and it's a little bit of an unusual title, at least in my experience. I want to explain what it means because I think it's a little bit important to understand not only where I'm coming from, but also where Sauce Labs as a company is trying to go. So I've been a tester in software quality for 21 years. I started in 2001 as an API tester for a web monitoring company, and then I moved out through various SaaS companies, B2B. Then I worked for Retail Me Not, B2C, for about 7 or 8 years. And then I came to Sauce Labs because I felt like I wanted to try to help push the industry forward in a way that I thought it hadn't really been pushed in quite a while. And somewhere along the way, I started to become entranced by the idea of offering accessibility testing to users of this platform, because I think it's something I'm terribly passionate about, because I try to be inclusive in all ways with how I live my life, how we build our platform with everything. And I think that inclusive is the word that I always try to keep in mind when I'm talking about accessibility. And I know that the crowd that I'm speaking to, you don't need to be told what that means or explained anything more about that. And I will say that on a technical level, I'm not an accessibility expert, but I've spent 20 years in testing, and I believe I understand how these technologies can be married together so that you can use them seamlessly, you can use them for scale, and you can guarantee that you're giving the best experience to customers of all abilities. So with that, I'm going to talk a little bit more about testing as a concept, testing as a theory. I'm going to talk a little bit about testing as it relates to accessibility, but then I'm going to go into automation, concepts, scale. I might tell a story or two, and then hopefully wrap it all up with what we're now offering as a feature on Sauce Labs as an integration with the Axe Core open source DevTools framework. And then maybe a note about the future as well. After that, hopefully we'll get to Q&A, and then I'll be able to learn more about the specific concerns that are on your mind. And I'm not an expert. What I'm trying to do at Sauce Labs is tie these worlds together. So the Vice President of Technology Strategy is primarily concerned with taking a platform that historically has been concerned with functional Selenium testing in an automated way, to be able to provide users with scale, so that if you have 400 Selenium tests, you can run them all in several minutes by executing them on browsers that you rent from the cloud rather. And since the last couple of years, we've expanded this footprint to ways that I'll show kind of towards the end. But my job at Sauce Labs is to survey the platform that we're offering to our customers, identify gaps within that platform, and say, what are our customers asking us for that they need in order to make sure that their users are able to offer the most amount of testing with the least amount of effort? And then do we build, buy, or partner, acquire, or partner with companies in order to be able to fill these gaps into our platform? And I'm very, very happy and proud to say that we've delivered a partnership with DQ that allows us to give users access to a very thorough and good level of accessibility testing for the web on both desktop and emulator simulators mobile. And we're very soon going to offer it on Cypress. And then maybe some more enhancements to come after that around real mobile and native applications. So let's get into it. So what I'm hoping to get across today is what my assumption in preparing for this presentation has been that I'm bringing testing expertise and testing knowledge to people who are deeply passionate about accessibility. Now, if you had to do the reverse, where you had to put me in front of an audience teaching accessibility to a bunch of people who are doing testing, I don't think I'd fare quite as well, which is why we've invited DQ to come and speak at AxeCon in a couple of months. And maybe you can attend that session and find out how the mirror image of this session would work. But I'm here today to talk about testing kind of in general concept, and then try to see how it will apply. Now, the main thing that I think has shifted since I've been in the testing industry is that 20 years ago, when you put me down in front of a piece of software and you said, test that software, I would essentially ask, how is it supposed to work? What are the requirements that you used, the assumptions that you used in order to build this software feature by feature? And then I would start to poke holes in those requirements and start to poke holes in how the software works against the requirements. And to my shame, but also to the point that the industry just worked like this at the time, we rarely considered the user in these conversations. This is early on in the software making process. Everything was waterfall. It was pre-agile. Extreme programming was only barely on the roadmap. And we just thought about, the product owners know best. The product owners have sketched out requirements, and the product owners know how they want this thing to be tested. So we would take those requirements and we would apply them to testing. And then I would apply them to automation and make sure that we could scale up the testing against requirements as quickly as possible. So I would go looking for bugs. I would go try to ensure that everything works, 100% test code coverage. And I would essentially answer questions or I'd submit bug reports that would say a little bit more formal version of, they said the thing would be blue, but it wasn't blue. And it took me a long time, and it took this industry a long time to mature to the point where we would actually say, the problem isn't that it's not blue. The problem is that there's an error message and it doesn't tell me why I can't submit this form. You're blocking a fundamental user flow and preventing your users from being able to buy something from you. Now, there's a really good chance if you're e-commerce or if you're in software at any sort of scale, at some point, someone needs to be able to buy something from you. So that means that there's 1 or 2 or 5 most critical possible flows through your system. And you need to be able to identify those and to be able to say that they work with confidence. You need to be able to say your user is being blocked from doing the thing that you need them to do in order to pay you for what they want to get out of it. This also applies to things like medical or other areas where people aren't buying things directly. But if you take an application or even, a sub-application, a subset of one application, and you start to think about what the critical flow is, what you're really talking about there is not coverage. You're not talking about, I need to cover everything. You're talking about risk management. You're talking about making sure that the most fundamental way users can get delight out of my system, or I can get revenue from my customers. If there's an interruption to that workflow, almost nothing else matters. So it's not that you shouldn't test everything. You should always test everything, right? I'm just saying that your prioritization should be ruthless in terms of the risk to your business. And that if you're not covering something, if that thing is not critical to your business, you don't have to feel quite so bad about the fact that it might break. As an aside, I once worked with a team, some of the most talented automation Selenium engineers I've ever worked with. And I left on vacation. I went out of town for a couple of weeks and I came back. And the team very proudly, very diligently said, we did the thing that you asked to do while you were gone. We automated 200 test cases that show that you can do every permutation or combination of editing your profile on the website. And now that is 100% covered. So 200 Selenium test cases that have a really, really good pass rate. So once, maybe 5 tests every few days would fail because of flakiness or a slight product change. And it was all to be able to make sure that you could change your avatar, change your picture, change your name, change your location, change all sorts of stuff. 200 tests, something like that, probably a week and a half's worth of work for 4 engineers. And then I was having lunch with someone in the business intelligence area, someone who deals with user analytics. And I was bragging about the amazing accomplishments of my team. And that person said, why in the world would you have 4 engineers spend 2 weeks automating something that less than 0.5% of our users ever visit? When the fact is that there are flows that break all the time in terms of making sure our commission attribution cookie gets dropped on their browser. There's 2,400 different code paths that will drop a cookie, and about 400 of them are broke at any given time, which means that 1/6 of our revenue is flowing out the window because we don't drop the right cookie at the right time on the right browser with the right combination. Why in the world would you test user profile when any of these are still around? And honestly, that conversation changed my career. So for those of you who are just now starting out for the concept of testing, or you're developers in the accessibility space who need to learn about how to do testing, I'm here to tell you there's a really good chance, if you're not working on medical, healthcare, NASA, launching space shuttles, you really don't have to test everything. What you need to do is make sure that you're covering the most critical flows for your users as they move through your system, particularly from an accessibility point of view, because I believe someone today has probably given the statistics that 12 to 18% of users need some sort of assistive technology in order to be able to move through your system. And if you're leaving them behind in the most critical workflows, you're missing out and they're missing out, and you're likely not to be forgiven for it. There's all sorts of statistics that show how quickly users will abandon applications if they have a single bad experience on them. And I'm just as guilty. I read today that 65 apps exist on nearly every smartphone. The average number of apps on a given smartphone is 65. People interact with maybe 20 at any given, I don't say, couple of week period. And I definitely have apps that I have not deleted off of my phone that I will probably never use again because of issues like this. It's not that it's not a pretty app. It's not that it doesn't work fast, but the most critical flow has a couple of hiccups in it. And since it's not my bank, I don't need it. I don't need that in my life. So what I'm getting at is you need to be able to take the concept of accessibility, automated testing, and risk-based testing and cram them all together. You're not just concerned that it's blue or not blue. You're concerned that there's low contrast between these elements. And your automation, your historical Selenium tests probably wouldn't have even picked that up ever if you had designed them to. But when you use a combination of Selenium plus Axcore to do the scanning of your visual layout, then it will start to tell you and pick up automatically on cases where your contrast isn't high enough. And that right there makes you more inclusive if you're able to make a statement with confidence that you've got these areas of risk covered, especially on your most critical flows. So 22 years of QA experience is telling you you probably don't need to cover everything. What you need to do is cover a few things excruciatingly well. Now, I have never suffered consequences of deleting a few hundred tests out of 1,000 test suite, 1,000 case test suite if I delete the tests that simply don't matter. One thing I definitely see a lot is automated tests that fail consistently and they're just tolerated. We say, I have 1,000 tests and at any given point, 60 to 80 of them are failing for various reasons. And the statement that I hear when I hear that we have that kind of tolerance, and believe me, I've been guilty of this in the past until I sort of saw the light. The statement that I hear when people say that they're tolerant of these failures is that they have promised coverage to someone in the business. They said that this part of the code is being covered with automated testing, and the truth is that it's not being covered. You don't know what's being covered, and you don't know the value that you're getting out of that test automation. So I'm here to entreat you to keep your builds green and to keep only the tests that are the most critical possible tests at least in the Selenium functional ecosystem, in order to make sure that the user interface can properly render the outputs of an API. Once you've done that, and you've done the minimal set possible, you can make a quantitative statement about your risk exposure upon release, particularly if you've incorporated accessibility tooling into your set. So let's move on to talk about more in depth in general around automation, more broadly. As I've alluded to, testing really well is difficult because we tend to approach, Selenium testers tend to approach web testing with the same mindset. Now that's a generalization, but I've been doing Selenium so long, I've seen it as being endemic through the testing world. And I'm hoping that the audience I'm speaking to is savvy enough to understand that Selenium is not the only tool that you should be using in test automation. It is a vital tool. But as we move on and as we evolve as an industry, the other vital tools like API testing and Cypress testing and even mobile or rather beta real world testing, as well as things like production, feature flags, error monitoring. These things are just as critical to the quality process as Selenium has been. And the aim here is to encourage you to weave that sort of testing throughout the rest of the process, stretch the testing process from the center, the big bottleneck, to the left and to the right, so that testers are not testers, but everyone is in charge or responsible for or accountable to some amount of quality in their platform. Achieving that well is hard. But once you've achieved it, you'll never go back. It gives you a kind of confidence in your release process that is hard to describe. And it's almost hard to believe when you just hear someone like me talking about it at a conference. But once you've seen it, and once you've lived through it, and you no longer have to convene a committee of 4 people on a Zoom call at 5 o'clock in the morning because you have a change to release, and then you have to be there in case there's a rollback that's necessary. Once you get over and don't need that anymore, it's transformational to your organization. Now, the reason you automate is to be able to take a computer and have it do the part of the job that the human hates. I am not personally of the belief you should ever plan to or assume that you can eliminate the human from the testing process altogether. I believe I'm not going to say it's impossible, because I don't like making extreme 100% statements, but I don't think I expect it within my lifetime. Certainly not within the expected career I expect, the duration. I think that there is always going to be a need for human eyes on a product. And what we want to do is make sure that the human eyes that are on the product are doing things that are exploratory and high energy and high usefulness and high engagement, and make sure that they are able to take the end user's perspective around a part of your product. Use a really critical eye to make sure that you're representing their interests. Automation is there to get rid of the toil of testing the same thing over and over and over and over again. It's not there to replace the human. It's there to be guided by the human as it removes the toil. Because by the 20th time you're checking the same element to make sure it's the right shade of blue, you're going to start missing things. You're going to start missing details. You need the computer to step in at that point and give you a good idea of what's going on. Now, the other thing we do with automation is that we make sure that for all of the different combinations of Chrome versions, Firefox, Safari, the different versions of those, the operating systems underneath those, the different versions of the operating systems that lie underneath them. All of these combinations, we need to make sure that automation can scale, can help you scale in that you don't have to repeatedly launch this thing, run this test, launch this thing, run this test, launch this thing, run this test. You should be able to write one script that can be executed on 15, 20, or 800 different platforms that you need to be able to execute them on. And that's how you scale yourself. I heard a story about a very well-known online marketplace that I shouldn't repeat the name simply because I don't believe they do this practice anymore. But from what I understand, this worked very, very well early on in their development. They had 7 Selenium tests that would gate their release. They executed those 7 different tests on browser combinations, probably 30 or 40 different browser combinations. So there were between 210, 280 tests that would get run before every release. Same 7 tests on all these browsers that would make sure that they verified the most critical flows on every browser version they cared about. And they were confident then that they could release. Sure, the user profile editor might be broken. They're not going to lose money from that. They might make some people angry from that. They're probably not going to lose customers. You can fix that stuff in time. But that kind of automation to get your release for the most critical flows using multiple platforms at the same time, that is how you are able to get the computer to do what the computer's best at and automate the toil that makes your eyes glaze over and makes you not really want to continue looking at it. Another statement around what I call the combinatorial explosion means that if you have 5 or 6 different ways to traverse your process, and then you add that to all the different variations that can go into there, particularly around error cases and stuff like that, then you add browser OS combinations, browser versions combinations, you start to get to the millions of test cases that you need to be able to execute. And there are some mathematical grouping techniques, set reduction techniques that you can do to make this a little bit easier on yourself. But for the most part, what you know going into it, if you just do some very simple math, is that you cannot hire enough people to keep up with the demands, especially at how quickly people are shipping software these days. The next thing is that automation can combine multiple checks into a single step, especially through things like visual analysis. Used to be a long time ago with Selenium testing, you would have to query particular web elements for attributes and say, what is the CSS class of this, or what is the color of that, or what is the XY position of this, or what is the link that this one goes to. And now with visual testing, you can usually take a snapshot of the page and compare it or analyze it for delta from the baseline of the previous screenshot that you would have taken. And a computer is very, very good at doing that at scale, because as the AI ML processes have matured in companies like Applitools and Sauce Labs, we're able to do a very, very game job of informing you when these things start to get out of place. And what we're trying to do now is apply this to accessibility. It's also really important to be able to keep complex business logic and edge cases and make sure that those can be replicated. One of my favorite use cases for automation is to be able to take either API or Selenium or Cypress test cases from customer support when a user submits a bug, and be able to generate an automated test to make sure that in the future that same use case is covered when you need to re-execute a test suite. And it's very, very helpful to make sure that regressions are not introduced into the product. And it gives you a lot of confidence as well. Now, I am going to make an assumption here that everyone understands what A11Y means. Please let me know if it isn't, but you're going to start seeing that on a few slides from here on out. A11Y means accessibility. So if you are already struggling to keep up with features as developers, or you're a developer and you're writing them too fast, and you already don't have time to do testing, you already aren't given enough leeway, enough ground cover to be able to do the kinds of testing that you need to do. And then suddenly you learn that you need to be compliant to one of the 6 different standards bodies of accessibility, especially if you work for the government. That's always going on. How can you just work that into the process? And the truth is you have to, so you do it, but at the cost of what on some other end? There's a good chance that there's a trade-off being made. If you're being told to do accessibility testing manually, there's probably some other feature set that you're missing. So automation of the accessibility checks doesn't cover everything, does not count for an audit, does not mean you are standards compliant, but it does give you a leg up as to where to start looking for issues. And it gives you a very, very good idea of the biggest pain points that your customers might see as they're traversing through your product. And also keep in mind that the purpose of unit tests is to make sure that localized changes to code don't mess up anything. But the purpose of integration tests is to make sure that things that are broken on a clear other team far, far away, they are not breaking what's going on your end. Now, truthfully, I don't know if this is a common problem with accessibility where another team's code can mess up the accessibility rating of my code. I don't know. I would love to hear in the comments or at the Q&A time whether or not that is a prolific problem. But I know that anyone who's been working in software for any amount of time, they see this kind of problem of interoperability constantly, but especially now that we're moving into the world of microservices and contracts, where contracts tend to break sometimes when it's not published or when it's not being checked continuously. So I'd love to know more about that around specifically around accessibility, how it's affected by these things. And then part of the problem that I've started to see as developers are being encouraged more and more to start writing automated tests and being involved in testing is that developers tend not to have the same it's difficult for me to use a word that's not like, it's difficult for them to have the same appreciation. It's not entirely true. It's difficult for them, for you, you can't really make the assumption that they have the same level of training for testing, because testing, as much as people don't necessarily like to admit it or don't really recognize that this is true, testing is a craft. It's something that you spend years learning. And for all of the ASTQB certifications out there and all the sorts of ways that you can approach testing and talk about cyclomatic complexity and all those terms, the truth is that there really is a method to it, even though it has to apply to any kind of different software under the sun. It is there to replicate the user's mindset, and it is not always something that can be assumed that a developer will have that, or not even. It's not even about their mindset. It's about the amount of time they've got to apply those concepts. And so people who don't come from this craft may not have the same mindset, may not have the same approach, and may not have the right perspective to be able to test these things thoroughly. Now, in some cases, they absolutely do. But in my experience, this is something that I see as a risk as the world moves away from having dedicated QA and testers into a world of ops where everyone owns quality, and some people might not have those perspectives quite on lock. Now, this is a statistic I got from Dylan Barrel, and I really would love for someone to correct me if I got this wrong. But my understanding is that 90% of accessibility problems in software come down to one of 12 different issues from WCAG. And if someone like Mike Farrell is on, someone like that, they can correct me, they can tell me exactly at some point the nuances of this. But to me, this is an extraordinary good point, because that means we can do better than the 80/20 rule when it comes to applying accessibility rules and scanning to test automation. Because what DQ has found is that 50% of accessibility problems can be found through automation. Now imagine taking a massive workload that you have, days and days and days of testing for every release that you've got, to be able to make sure that it's viewable by people, or that screen readers can access it properly. 50% of that work can go away by doing simple scans via automation. And that's what we're here to show today, is that I'm going to show a video here about a demonstration of this running on Sauce Labs, about how you can create a Selenium test case with 2 lines of code. Session.get accessibility results, if you're using the Sauce bindings that we use for Java, where you can send a test case to Sauce Labs, a Selenium test case, and then immediately, within seconds, you can go to Sauce Labs interface, you can watch a video of the test as it ran, and you can see in just a couple of seconds here, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit, you can see that an accessibility-enabled report is automatically generated inside the user interface alongside the test that was executed on Sauce Labs. So if you need to do web testing on desktop web, so Chrome, Safari, Firefox, you can today use Sauce Labs, even in a free trial, and send it a Selenium test with the right instrumentation, and you will get a heads up on your compliance. Now, like I said, this is not an audit. This does not guarantee compliance. This gives you a main idea of some critical features that you might be missing, or things that you need to go and look at in order to have a good idea of where to approach issues with accessibility. This is a partnership we've worked on over the past 6 months, I'd say, and it's one of the proudest moments of my career at Sauce Labs, and maybe even my whole career, is that we were able to integrate this fairly seamlessly. Because in my opinion, if all your Selenium grid is doing is executing test cases and giving you results and giving you data, it's no better really than a dishwasher. I mean, it's fine. I love my dishwasher. It's very important to have a dishwasher. I don't want to wash dishes manually. However, what if the dishwasher could give you insights about, the food you're eating, or the diet that you have, or anything like that? What if it could passively see what's going on inside and give you more information than you had already? One of my most fervent passions at Sauce Labs is adding value like this so that the user has to, maybe add one line of code to their test, and suddenly you get information about your page load performance times, you get information about accessibility, and then in the future, hopefully, you get information about things like security and other issues where we should be already telling you passively what's going on inside your site, inside your tests, and how you could be doing things better, and just giving you more value. I accidentally launched into a soft sales pitch. I apologize. But the point is that the world of Selenium testing needs to change. And part of what I'm trying to accomplish here with you today, as well as on the Selenium project itself, is to make sure that it does more than just tell you true, false, it worked, it didn't work. And so here we have this. And then I don't know if I need to tell you about what happens when we miss some stuff. But this graph right here is, I don't have an attribution on this, and I apologize for that. This is from a study. I don't remember the name of the company that did the study, showing how sort of the relative cost of defects when they are found at unit testing or in code. Sometimes, in my opinion, this should go even further to the left with requirements gathering, that the cost of an escaped defect becomes exponential the longer it goes out. And you could just think of that as simply as how many people are involved in fixing a bug as it gets out into production. And
I think it was IBM. Marcus,
IBM?
Sorry to jump in. Yeah,
I appreciate that very much. I usually have a bit.ly link down to show the attribution for this slide, and I think I accidentally deleted it through some styling or something like that. So I apologize. So these studies have been going on for years, and they find very consistent results on the astronomical cost of defects as they slip. And if you think then about the famous Domino's Pizza lawsuit, I probably don't have to tell anyone in this crowd about that. But it's, the Supreme Court told Domino's Pizza that they needed to be ADA compliant on their website because it's the same as having a ramp in their storefront. If we don't look at accessibility, we are excluding people from being able to use our software, and we don't want that. More importantly, it's simply the right thing to do. And once again, everyone here understands that. Now, I want to cross out the word failed on this slide, and I want to say that design cannot rescue inaccessible content. We have to own up to the fact that it takes in order to make sure that we're in compliance. And automation, in my opinion, is the fastest way to do that. So I think everyone's aware of this standard. This slide is more for my testing audience who needs to learn about accessibility than the accessibility audience who needs to learn about testing. But this is what we're trying to help with, is understanding what we're headed for. So let's talk a little bit about how to do accessibility testing in an automated way. So beginning testers, developers, people tend to, when they're first looking through and trying to do testing, you tend to say, how can I use this the way the user uses it? How can I make sure that the happy path is satisfied? And then you look at how the UI renders the happy path first. And then you check for error fields and messages. And then for accessibility, you check for accessibility IDs. What we're trying to do is decide, and this is definitely a place where I don't want Q&A here. I don't necessarily want questions. I want to know feedback. Do you need to test the audio coming out of your iPhone in order to be able to make sure that your app is accessible? Because I have a hypothesis that you should be looking to make sure that your application is instrumented with accessibility IDs that a screen reader can look at. And that if someone tells me that they need to be able to hear the audio, what I am afraid of is that they don't realize that that's essentially testing Apple's screen reader software, not my own application. That's a hypothesis. I am willing to be talked out of that being correct, and I'm willing to be told we actually need to hear the audio. But I want to know, I would like to hear from you. This is a very important question for us right now because we are looking at offering screen reader audio support. And it turns out that it's easier to do on some platforms than others, and that we could go to market sooner if we didn't need to do it. With my hypothesis that you don't actually need to do it, we could potentially go to market sooner, but I don't know if I'm right. I really would like some guidance on this. So screen readers are obviously queued by IDs that are attached to visual elements. So the screen reader scans for those to tell you that this is first name, this is last name, this is address, as opposed to text field, text field, text field. So the question is, do you need to hear the audio, or is that really just testing Apple? You don't want to test Apple. I want to know. This is the point where I wish I was on Twitch or something streaming, so the chat could tell me.
I'll bring those in towards the end. They're rolling in. Don't worry.
Oh, great. I appreciate that. I'm almost through the content, so we're almost at that point. So another thing that I want to advise, and this is just sort of a general testing technique, and take it for how much you paid for it. Basically, if you're trying to make sure it incorporates Facebook, PayPal, Twitter, Google, Amazon, Akamai, Adobe, that are things that you incorporate, what I would encourage you to do is try to mock them as much as possible and try to see if you can get a hold of some service virtualization, something like that. Because what I find is that teams get stuck trying to figure out, okay, we need to make sure that the PayPal test account has some feature flags turned on, something like that. And the truth is that you don't need to test PayPal. You don't need to test Twitter. You don't need to test Google. You should only under your control and mock everything out as much as possible, even to the extent of finding other teams who are making microservices within your company that you rely on. Implement some sort of contract testing so that you can always know they broke their microservice. I can't rely on it. Therefore, but I can't rely on their microservice, but I cannot let that stop me from being able to certify my release or make progress on the testing for my release. Now, these things are sometimes displayed in your UI. They're sometimes there. You can actually even do really advanced techniques like take a proxy and cancel any requests to those services where they don't matter. But the truth is, contract testing should be enough, and contract testing and mocking should be enough to make sure that you can avoid accidentally testing somebody else's software that you don't control. I think that's an important distinction, especially if people are just now entering the field of testing. That's important. Now, I want to talk a little bit about this. Is hopefully as pitchy as I'll get, and truthfully, this doesn't have anything to do with Sauce Labs. But when I grew up in testing, it was always considered this massive bottleneck and just a big pain. It was this thing that would interrupt the flow from a developer's keyboard to the user. And then we started talking about shifting left, moving the test effort earlier and earlier in the cycle so the developer is writing tests. And some people even have the idea that developers will write Selenium tests. And I can tell you that after trying to train something like 200 developers at 3 different jobs on how to write better Selenium tests, I don't think I ever had a single one who contributed consistently over any period of time. I do not believe that developers are going to be willing to write Selenium tests as Selenium tests. Now, there's frameworks that will abstract Selenium. Cucumber is one. There's some others that work just fine in that regard. But for developers, I tend to encourage things like in-production error monitoring, as well as tools like Cypress, in order to be able to make testing easier. API testing is another very good contribution for developers. Another notion that has come up more is shift right, where we say we're going to push the burden of testing all the way into production. But the truth is, you know so little about the signal before you get to production, that it causes its own kind of bottleneck, because all you're doing then is managing feature flags and canary builds and A/B testing and all that stuff. And you end up doing a lot of work twice. Now, I don't know any companies who eliminated QA and went straight to that, but I know that was a point of conversation that made me awfully nervous that people were about to get themselves into a heap of trouble. What I think we should do, and I alluded to this, is eliminate all of that in favor of doing a little bit of testing everywhere along the way. I think of it like as food moves through a kitchen, and each chef and sous chef has to taste little pieces of it before they assemble the final dish, make sure that it's all good. That way nothing is interrupted. As I've sat here, I haven't had a counter, but I believe this is true, that Amazon.com has shipped, I'm going to do some real quick math, 240 features since I started giving this talk, if their statistics are being believed.
And Facebook, another 100.
Yep, Facebook, another 100. Do they have bottlenecks? Do they have this in their testing? They do not. And not everyone can be that like this. Not everyone, it's not appropriate for everyone to achieve that, but it certainly is feasible for some people, and it's certainly doable if we can be very thoughtful, very mindful, and make sure that we're only testing the things that are the most critical at the stage we need to test them. And most importantly, only testing as much of the user interface as we need to make sure it can render the outputs of the API and make things accessible for our users. Now, that's a pitch slide. I want to just move straight to the QA. I really appreciate everyone's attention to this point. And please tell me where I'm wrong about stuff. I want to hear it.
Awesome, Marcus. Yeah, I was just about to chime in and tell you we got about 7 minutes left. We can maybe go a little bit long because it's the last session in the day. We'll see. Show pro guys kicking me under the desk, maybe. Let's jump right into some of the more. I like to be democratic about these questions, and a lot of them have been upvoted already. So let's jump in. Here's one. This is from Anonymous. How do you begin to integrate accessibility testing automation in a large organization that currently doesn't do this? Where do you even start?
Where I would start is by, I mean, I'm going to speak a little bit selfishly here, but you could do this without Sauce Labs. You don't need Sauce Labs for this. Is I would take an open source library like Axe Core. If you are, so this is my answer is assuming that you're doing Selenium testing. And so I don't know if you're not. If you're doing automation and you're not doing accessibility, my assumption is that you're doing UI Selenium testing, very traditional. And we could talk about if that assumption is wrong, but at this point, my answer is very simply that there is tooling right now with Axe Core to make it as easy as adding a Maven dependency, adding 4 or 5 lines of Java code to a test, and you instantiate your WebDriver, you instantiate the DQ AxeCon, I think it's called, I don't remember what the name of the object is, the AxeCon object or the Axe Core object, and you have it hit a URL and then run a scan. And I would just say the biggest agent I found in large companies is for one team to just nail it on all forms. So if you have a team nearby that's doing accessibility testing, you can start to reach out to them and say, what are you finding? Here's the report we generated through automation. That report gets generated in a very consumable form from Axe Core, and you can just already have it with 5 lines of code. I would start small, and I think what I would try to do is be a tiny bit political, and I would start running these scans, and I would wait until one of them has a critical error that's found, and I would then bring that to someone who cares and say, this is going to bring us out of compliance. How did you find that? It just, with the Selenium testing we're already doing, it just got generated.
For free.
And yeah, for free.
Almost,
and I would, yeah, exactly. And I would just say to get a small win quickly and then be able to take that to stakeholders who care. That's the way you make change happen. You could go bigger. It just depends on how much time you have and how much risk you're willing to tolerate.
There is some, so for anybody who's maybe hung up on Java Selenium or anything like that, there's some questions about Cypress and when all that's going to be available. I think we might owe you some startup documents, but this stuff works in Cypress, Puppeteer, Playwright, WebDriver IO, Ruby, other language bindings. You're not going to be constrained by that.
Absolutely.
Using it on Sauce Labs as well.
Yep.
And that kind of, I'm not supposed to answer questions as a moderator, but I kind of just did.
No, I appreciate that.
So that was a great question. Let's get another one in. This one might be more of a DQ question. Somebody was interested in learning about where that statistic came from, the 95% 12. I think Glenda might have answered that in the chat. That came from Dylan, and probably Glenda might have had something to do with that. So I'm going to stay out of that subject matter expertise waters for this talk.
Well, I can tell you where I got it, which was last year.
Maybe
Dylan gave us a presentation at SauceCon last April, where he demonstrated this tool running on Cypress, and he gave that statistic as part of that talk.
I gotcha.
So yes, it absolutely works on Cypress, and that's where I got it.
Yeah. So reach out to DQ or Marcus. We can get you more information about that. There's a study and all kinds of stuff.
Yeah.
This is a really popular one, and a question I'm a fan of. What training do you recommend for QA to help with automation with accessibility in mind? Kind of a getting started type.
I mean, I think that I don't know what your favorite programming language is, or if you haven't selected one yet. I wouldn't take my advice, because I'm all Java all the time, but I'm a little weird. So people seem to be gravitating away from Java. It makes me sad. But then again, here, I'll give you this advice. Follow Angie Jones on Twitter. She loves Java. And so it sounds much better coming from her than from me. So I would say pick your language, and then either choose something. So this is saying getting started with accessibility testing, which means to me, you're going to want to have a web browser involved at some point. And with that, you have choices. You can do any one of Cypress, Puppeteer, Playwright, Test Cafe. Any one of those four will give you a browser that is able to tell you signals about accessibility, and they all use JavaScript. Then if you want to launch a full browser with black box testing to do end-to-end testing of everything with Selenium, then you choose Selenium, and you choose any one of Java, JavaScript, C#, Ruby, or Python as language bindings to make those things work. And I wouldn't call it easy. It's Selenium itself is tricky, and a lot of people consider it to be a tool that has risk of flaky tests. In my opinion, it's not a flaky tool. It's that tests need to be properly engineered in order to not be flaky. And that is sometimes rather challenging, because Selenium, unlike Cypress, and this is why I like pushing people towards Cypress, Selenium is not a testing tool. It is a robotic browser driving mechanism. It'll do exactly what you tell it to do, whereas Cypress has testing semantics built into it. So if you like JavaScript already, couldn't recommend Cypress highly enough. If you prefer Java, or you want to, Cypress has some limitations that I won't go into here. If you read about those limitations and decide you can't live within those limitations, it's Selenium, and just pick your language.
Yeah, and that might tie into the next question, and this comes up a lot. Kimberly, it says, are there different tools, concerns, or recommendations for testing Shadow DOM and custom components, like web components, I'm assuming?
Yeah.
Most of the stuff you just named is going to be totally compatible with Shadow DOM, but yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, just that Selenium 4.0 supports the Shadow DOM. I feel like some issues were found, but I think they may have been fixed by now. This is the second question I've had on Shadow DOM today, and I truthfully don't have a quippy answer, but I do believe that Cypress and Selenium are made to support testing with Shadow DOM right now. We're
about at time, but let's take another popular one. Now, this is a great one. It's anonymous. Do you think analytics have a role to play in risk-based accessibility testing?
I'm going to say, so you strike the word accessibility from that sentence, and I'm going to say 1,000%. If you Google my name and the word analytics, you're going to find I have about 6 different lectures I've given about how to do analytics testing, because it's one of my favorite topics. Analytics testing are the rocket fuel to your career if you work at a place that heavily relies on analytics and they're not being tested or looked at by the QA community. Changed my career when I discovered how powerful analytics testing is. Now, what I don't know is how it applies to accessibility, which is why I was hesitant to bring it into this conversation. That is something that I should probably talk to Travis and other people about at DQ. I would love to have that conversation.
There are people interested in your Twitter handle if you're on Twitter?
Oh yeah, it's at MMERRELL. Normally I put it on every single slide. I didn't do that this time. I apologize.
Well, you owe us slides still, so you can add it before you submit them. Yeah, there's a lot of people looking for your slides too. So
it's at MMERRELL. And I don't actually tweet much. Mostly I retweet people like Angie Jones.
Awesome. Well, we have a lot of good interaction here. Unfortunately, we are at time. I want to thank you, especially Marcus, and the audience. And yeah, that's about it for this session. And we'll hopefully see you guys tomorrow for some more AxeCore fun.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Travis. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Marcus. Cheers.